Good afternoon to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our tropical weather outlook video for today, June 6, 2024. Let's get started. First off, with the National Hurricane Center homepage. Same routine as it is every single day. How does it look like over the next week in the Atlantic? At least from the National Hurricane Center, it looks quiet, and we're not looking at anything significant occurring right now. Same thing in the Eastern Pacific. Both basins are quiet. Looks like there's not much going on activity-wise, although models right now is a little bit of a different story. We might have something soon, at least to talk about in terms of Atlantic activity, but at least right now, as expected by the National Hurricane Center, things are quiet. Satellite shot of the Atlantic kind of also shows the same thing. Nothing much going on in terms of activity. We have a few areas of showers and thunderstorms across the Caribbean and southwestern Atlantic, although nothing looks like it'll try to develop or take any sort of shape into anything that is very threatening. There's lots of strong upper level wind shear, and just environmentally, things are not that favorable right now. And you can even look in the Eastern Pacific as well. Lots of convection is in the Eastern Pacific and even in the Atlantic too. In portions of the far southern MDR, there's some convection, although this is really associated with the ITCZ, or the Intertropical Convergence Zone, as we like to call it. But nothing, once again, looks like it's going to develop into much at all. And taking a look at that from a perspective with the vorticity, there is nothing much really to speak of, even in vorticity to the MDR, at least in terms of our waves. They've really not been that potent right now in order to really show up in terms of anything strong. You can really see most of the waves that we do have are probably dead by now. And if we take a look at the vorticity, you can see that there's really nothing much in terms of strong waves. Most of the energy right now you can still see is located in the mid-latitudes of the atmosphere. Even into early June, we still have a process that needs to be done of energy moving northward, lifting up into the mid-latitudes and into the higher latitudes of the Atlantic before we could really get energy to flourish in the tropics and we could start getting deep tropical development. Right now, there's still not much happening. But in the Eastern Pacific, on the other hand, there's a lot of energy going on, and it's all kind of mushed together and stretched out. There's nothing consolidating, and we don't see anything concrete to watch for development in the Eastern Pacific as well. So with that being said, it kind of just goes into the idea that everything will remain quiet, at least over the next week or so. But once again, we do got to focus in on the Western Atlantic and maybe the Eastern Pacific beyond the 1 week time frame, because maybe things could start to get favorable, as we have been mentioning for the last several weeks. Looks like mid-June is the time frame to watch. But once again, right now, in terms of wind shear too, it really is definitely also not favorable. These are the upper level winds of the atmosphere. And whenever you see all of these upper level wind bars concentrated and stacked on top of each other the way we do, especially across portions of the Caribbean and southwestern Atlantic like we see right now, this is indicative of very, very strong upper level winds, and it is just not favorable for development. Strong upper level winds blows atop of these convective cloud tops. It pushes them, it tilts them to the side, and these cloud tops that we look at for development of tropical systems cannot rise upward and organize properly with strong upper level wind shear. It just can't happen. And until we see all this wind shear relax, we're not going to see anything major develop in the Atlantic. We want something, I guess we want it to look a lot more like what we see right now here in the central MDR. There is actually quite a bit of low wind shear. There's not really much strong upper level wind. So this is something you would maybe look at more ideally if you're looking at development of the system. But obviously, thermodynamics are just not favorable, and the atmosphere is just not ready yet for our first system to occur. Thank God, though, there's nothing happening, because take a look at the sea surface temperature anomalies in the Atlantic, and this is something we've been talking about since winter, just how warm the Atlantic is. We see widespread areas of the Atlantic as much as 1, and widespread areas, especially in the eastern MDR, upwards of even 2 degrees Celsius above the long-term average. These are sea surface temperature anomalies, meaning the departures from normal. And the departures from normal here are well above normal compared to where we should be in the Atlantic, which means there's just so much energy in the ocean. And whenever there will be something, I sure bet you that it'll probably have no time and no sort of struggle get going anywhere in the Atlantic this year, honestly, especially in the areas that matter the most in the deep tropics. Um, there definitely won't be an issue in storms getting going once they do have the conditions that are atmospherically favorable, because this is just one part of this is just one piece of the puzzle, if you will, the very record warm, basically, sea surface temperature anomalies that we have in the Atlantic. But obviously, as I did mention before, until we have wind shear let up, we're not going to get anything to really take advantage of these really warm sea surface temperature anomalies. But the fact that they're there, it automatically sets up the Atlantic already for something that once we do get development going, there is definitely a lot of energy to work with. And just not only reflected in the sea surface temperature anomalies, but in the raw sea surface temperatures too. Just zooming in on the Gulf of Mexico alone. And the thing about the Gulf is that even if it's warm right now, by the time we get to the peak of the hurricane season, it'll always be ready for development to occur. But still, even when we have a basin that generally is always warm enough for tropical development, no matter what kind of year, um, we still, even the Gulf is well above normal. Just take a look at how it is right now. We have widespread anomalies, 28s, especially 29s too in early June, even for the Gulf. This is actually getting quite a bit excessive. We have 29s stretching up all the way into the central Gulf, and even portions, although small pockets right now, but I'm telling you, definitely as we head closer towards August and September, these will become a lot more widespread. 30 Celsius, really right off the southwestern coast of Florida. And sometimes you can't always rule out whenever we get development, when we get that rapid intensification right before landfall. Sometimes these really warm sea surface temperatures right near the coast really help. And that's not the only area we have it too, right off the coast of Florida and also in the Bay of Campeche too. And in general, we could say, yeah, there's really warm anomalies. There's 30, there's 29, but the general picture is that the Gulf is really warm, and it's really important because not only is the Gulf generally warm, and we're already seeing it warmer, more excessive than what the Gulf when the Gulf usually is warm, but this is also an area that is closer to home, and it's also an area that is closer to home that we watch for this time of year as well. So that means that the atmosphere, once it gets primed, I'm just going to tell you right now, it'll definitely be favorable, and we'll definitely have something at least try, because the Gulf is very warm, it is very primed, and it's not just the Gulf too. Zoom it out on a wide scale, 28 Celsius, basically as far as the eye could see across the deep tropics, and 28 Celsius, if you convert that to Fahrenheit, that is already mid 80s almost in terms of what the ocean temperatures are in Fahrenheit. And in terms of Fahrenheit, the general cutoff for when we start looking at sea surface temperatures for what supports development tends to be around 26 Celsius or upper 70s, low 80s in Fahrenheit. And the fact we already have mid 80s widespread across the deep tropics, it certainly says a lot in terms of energy in the ocean. And this is actually something else that I want to bring up, and this is a good way to actually reflect how much energy that we have in the ocean, and that is the ocean heat content. Mainly because, one, not only have the sea surface temperature anomalies and the general sea surface temperatures have been such a talk about the Atlantic this year, it's also been the ocean heat content. And this is all you really need to know. Just look at how much of these yellows and these oranges we have here, especially these anomalies of ocean heat content that we have concentrated in the Caribbean and the Gulf. And the higher these values are, what this basically means is the more that the ocean extends deep below the surface, which means, as it relates here, the ocean heat content, the more amount of heat content in the ocean there is, or energy there is, for storms to develop. And just look at how much upper ocean heat content, um how high they are on the scale across the entire Caribbean and even into the Gulf. And even in most portions of most of the Gulf anyways, the northern Gulf, we're probably going to see it warm up eventually, as we continue on with the summer. But even in portions of the central Gulf and southern Gulf already, values of the upper ocean heat content, I believe this is measured in joules per kilogram. I'm not entirely sure with the metric, but I think it has to do with joules. Just look at how much upper ocean heat content that is abundant and plentiful already in portions of the southern Gulf. The Caribbean is very plentiful and it's very widespread. There's no need to worry about upper ocean heat content in the Caribbean. Well, in terms of whether or not there's enough, because there's more than enough in the Caribbean, but especially in places like the Gulf that we already have this much upper ocean heat content. And by the way, upper ocean heat content has been at record levels this year as well too. It's only a matter of time before we get something to develop under favorable atmospheric conditions, which will for sure most definitely come at some point this year, especially given the favorable background setup we have. It's only a matter of time before something takes advantage of all these very warm sea surface temperatures and the fact that we have so much of that below the ocean, which is represented by the very high upper ocean heat content we have. It's a nasty picture for sure, and it's only a matter of time before we see a system take advantage of all these things. But in the next week or so, once again, I'm saying, just take a look at the GFS. Not much happening over the next week. We actually already stopped it at 5 days. You can see there's not much going on in terms of vorticity in the Atlantic. We do not have any areas that are trying to concentrate in terms of vorticity, which is what we want to look for development, and we don't see anything really getting going over the next week. But you can see, though, there are the beginnings of something potentially getting going, at least on the GFS. If we look at it at hour 168, this is roughly around mid-June, right where we're watching over the Caribbean and in the Southern Gulf. You can start to see, in terms of at least these wind bars, these are how the winds are moving in the lower levels of the atmosphere, because the vorticity is one thing, but it's also important to take a look at what the wind direction is. And you can see we're starting to see some sort of general cyclonic motion begin to occur at the 850 millibar level of the atmosphere. And this is broad right now. We tend to call these setups Central American gyres, and this tends to happen as well around this time of year in May and June, and also in the late season as well. And sometimes this can yield to development to occur in the Atlantic, but sometimes they also just remain very broad too, because it's called a gyre because it is a very broad area of cyclonic low-level winds, and it happens over Central America, and that's what we're seeing beginning to occur as we get to around a week out. And in fact, it's already began in some sort of way, but you really notice as we head over the next week or so, you could really see it begin to take shape over portions of the Yucatan and the Southern Gulf. And more oftentimes than not, this tends to favor more development in the Eastern Pacific and helps us get our first Eastern Pacific action, usually when it comes to these gyres that happen at this time of year. But still, they tend to sometimes develop stuff in the Atlantic. And this is all in line with signals that we've been talking about for the last several weeks, that around this time in June, as we're heading closer towards mid-months, that atmospherically we would see more rising motion and in general a more favorable window of for the opportunity for something to develop would come along. And I guess we're starting to see that reflected in the GFS model. The question does remain, though, whether or not it's actually something, because the GFS tends to be very inconsistent with this kind of stuff, and we could even take a look at other models too. But it's very far out into the future. We're talking about a week or so, more than a week or so out. So I'd rather wait it out and see whether or not it is actually a sure thing that we will get something to happen. But I guess you could say the groundwork, the foundation is there for potentially something towards mid-month. We'll have to watch the models to see, is it a for sure thing? With that being said, though, not much else to go over today, so we're going to end it off here. Thanks for watching. If you like what you saw today, as always, I encourage you to like, comment, subscribe, share with family and friends. Have a safe day. Have a blessed day. Peace, love, and kindness to all of you out there. And we'll talk again tomorrow.